Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Cara Stern.
And I'm Mike Moffatt.
This past week, Toronto Mayor Olivia Chow released her housing plan, and it differs fairly significantly from the recently released NDP housing plan, which we found a little surprising because Olivia Chow, of course, was once an NDP MP for Trinity Spadina from 2006 to 2014, and the numbers are so different that we really just wanted to understand why. So today, we're joined by Alex Beheshti, an urban planner and land economist at Altus Group. Welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's go through those numbers. So first, Olivia Chow's plan is $30 billion, which would be 60,000 homes, and that would be $500,000 per home. And let's compare that to the Ontario NDP plan, which is $15 billion and 250,000 homes, $60,000 per home. So that, $500,000 per home and $60,000 per home. First of all, why do they have such vastly different numbers?
So with the NDP housing plan, they are proposing to create a public builder or public financer called Ontario Homes. And they say that Ontario Homes will work with the nonprofit sector to help finance. So it's $15 billion in financing for the nonprofit sector, and that's to promote everything from co-op housing to rent geared to income housing. The mayor's plan is to spend $30 billion to directly finance and build 60,000 homes, and it's broken down as 70% market rate homes with rent control, 20% affordable housing units as defined by the City of Toronto, and 10% rent geared to income. There was a bit of a crosswire, I think, between the provincial plans and the mayor's plans in terms of feasibility or realism, however you want to take it. And I think, if, talking to folks within the industry, they generally say the mayor's plan is fairly realistic, however optimistic, because it's still based on a lot of things going right. Whereas the provincial plan there's definitely a discrepancy there in terms of the level of ambition with the level of resourcing.
And when you say affordable housing according to the Toronto guidelines, what does that mean?
So in the City of Toronto adopted the province's current, potentially expiring, potentially not expiring. We're kind of in this weird spot policy-wise. Definition of affordable housing, which is housing that is affordable between the 30th and 60th percentile of household incomes. And so the idea of a moderate income household is, a teacher working by themselves, maybe with a partner making a little bit of money. So that's kind of what two young workers household workers is kind of what you consider a moderate income household.
And when you said it has to be a lot of things going right, what are those things that have to go right for this to work?
So one is the financing side. So the mayor's plan, they envision an interest rate of between 3.2% and 3.75%. Now, the City of Toronto can get a lot of better financing terms than a household seeking a mortgage. People are, looking out their window and they're looking to their banks for financing, they're obviously not achieving those rates. So those are hard rates for the average person to achieve. They will be hard for the city to achieve over the next 10 years. However, if you consider that rates are coming down, or that's the prediction, then maybe that's achievable. In terms of construction costs, while they're dedicating about $500,000 per unit in their funding scheme, they are estimating that each unit will cost between $575,000 to $600,000. And so one of the other forms of optimism they have to have is that construction costs don't continue to escalate at the rate that they've been escalating. So, there's the headline inflation rate people typically hear is the consumer price index, and that's what a basket of goods and services a typical family would purchase. And we're just under 4% there. When it comes to construction costs, there is the building cost price index, the BCPI, and that's running at about 8% in the Toronto CMA, the Toronto region. So, and that's been running like that for, since 2016. We've been having low single to double digit increases in inflation in the construction costs. There's a lot of reasons for that, retirees. Uh, there's a lot of infrastructure projects going on right now that kind of tap into the same labor and capital that housing uses. So while at the same time we're trying to build a ton of affordable housing and market rate housing, we're also building the Ontario line. We're building other transit projects. So there's a lot going on and there's a lot of competition for a limited set of resources to build those things.
Mike, can you tell me what it means when they're saying when Olivia Chow was saying she will provide capital subsidies and public land for non-market housing intended to be deeply affordable? Can you like tell me what that means? I feel like it needs to be translated into plain language.
I actually don't entirely know what they're talking about. My guess would be that municipal governments have a lot of land. For instance, municipal governments have a lot of those green pea parking lots, which you could convert into housing, and the environmentalist in me would absolutely love to see that happen. So you would have this land that you could convert to housing. But we treat this as a free lunch sometimes. It's like, oh, we've got this land and it's free and we already have it. Well, there's a couple problems with that. That first, there's something already on the land that you have to get rid of, and then you need to do a whole environmental remediation on the site because you don't want to be building housing on soil that's had 100 years of gasoline poured on it. So that's the first issue. But and secondly, that is currently a revenue generating asset. That parking lot is generating money for the city, and that needs to be replaced somewhere. So a lot of this, talk, whether it be the municipal, the Toronto plan or the provincial plan, talks about basically this kind of free land as a free lunch. And, that's simply not the case. And although, again, the environmentalist in me absolutely wants to see these parking lots turned into housing, but that costs money. That's not free.
Are the lands mostly parking lots right now when they talk about ones that the city owns?
Well, I'd actually defer to Alex to that question. Those are the sort of obvious ones that I know about. But Alex, what other land assets that are in the city of Toronto, whether they be municipal or provincial?
So they have a plethora of different kinds of lands. One obvious one is the huge piece of land right beside, Ontario Place. The Expo lands. That's dead most of the year. That's land that they could potentially convert into housing. The city is going through a process of office rationalization. They're getting rid of about 1 million square feet. Now, some of those offices are rented, but some of those offices are city-owned land, and they're going to convert those offices into affordable housing sites. And they're sprinkled throughout the city. And then the other amount is, they have like service yards, or they have the lands that the TTC may have, green pea parking, as Mike mentioned. So, but you have to either replace what's on there, or as Mike said, and bang on, they pay rents. What I think is interesting about the mayor's plan in terms of information to the public is it cost about $600,000. We don't know how big these units are. I'm predicting they're averaging about a one bedroom, but it's $600,000 to build one of these homes, and the land is zero. You're getting financing rates that no private developer will ever get, and you are getting discounts on your development charges, your community benefit charges, and your parkland, and it's still $600,000. And I think what people need to understand is housing is expensive because it's expensive to build housing. But the thing that we all talk about how can we make housing more affordable, is all the other things that then pile on that make housing even more expensive. Housing should be expensive because it costs money to build right now, but it shouldn't be as expensive as I think a lot of people are experiencing. And sort of the mayor's plan is a good window into, so what happens if, we just the bare bones of the cost of building housing, and, still pretty tough.
What
Still pretty
costs
tough.
get waived when something's built by the government rather than a private sector company?
So traditionally, So just so people understand, development charges are still going to be paid by market rate housing. What the provincial government has brought in is that if it's nonprofit or if it's co-op housing, yeah, you don't need to do this whole song and dance to sign, signing ceremony or application process. It's pretty automated, which I think is a really, really powerful thing. And I think it also brings some fairness between municipalities. Some municipalities had programs to defer charges for nonprofit and co-op housing. Other municipalities didn't. And I think it brings a certain level of fairness between municipalities that they all have to kind of commit to this. Um, Governments can always waive charges against themselves. Another thing that
Yeah,
the
but
mayor.
I want to push back on that a little bit,
Sure.
because that it seems to me the argument is that governments can build housing cheaply by depriving themselves of money. So is that is that really, like, it almost seems like funny accounting, right? Where we're going, well, this should have cost 800,000, but we're getting it down to 600. But you're also taking $200,000 out of a pot of money, right? That municipalities need that infrastructure money, don't they? So, like, is this just funny accounting, or is there a there?
It's political, right? So it's easier for a government to defer charges to themselves because people can say, okay, I can believe that the $200,000 the government is taking out of this pot of money for infrastructure is going to create cheaper rent or a cheaper ownership option. People have a disbelief that if we give money to the private sector, that this money will not just be pocketed and used for profits or for somebody to go have expensive dinners, um, and it won't go to the renter or the potential homeowner. So on that basis, there's a bit of a different politics between providing exemptions for infrastructure on to a government or to a nonprofit versus to the market. But Mike's completely right. I mean, at some point, that capital budget to build infrastructure, whether it's bike parking spots, bike lanes, pipes, roads, subways, whatever. Somebody's got to pay for that, and there is a bit of an accounting trick going on here. Somebody's got to pay the piper at some point.
If we look at these two plans, they're like an order of magnitude difference, right? We're talking
Yeah.
about 600,000 versus 60, or at least that's what it looks like. So, is there sort of a like, is there something we're missing here? Because I look at this and I think it's completely bonkers. And the feedback I got on Twitter, and I'm sure you get the same, is just like why do you hate social housing? I'm like, no, I hate bad math, but is there something here that we're missing? Is this plan getting mischaracterized? Is there some way they can really do things cheaply? Like, is there some, almost some kind of devil's advocate position that we can take that suggests maybe the Ontario NDP plan isn't as completely bananas as it looks at first glance?
So I would say they're holding back a key piece of information somewhere. So if you look through the plan, it's a lot of financing dollars, and this is really critical because what you achieve versus financing dollars giving people cheap loans. That just goes on. That doesn't really hit the government's balance sheet. That's just the government going to the market, getting a nice bond, and that money will get paid back over 20 years. When you don't provide grant money, it's really hard to get that deeply affordable stuff. That is one dimension of like, hey, something's funny with this plan. Another issue with the NDP plan is, so yeah, $15 billion is not enough to get 250,000 affordable homes or non-market homes, as they would call it. One thing that they did put in their plan was they believe that they will get some sort of amount of units through inclusionary zoning. If you kind of run the rough math of $60,000 is not enough money to really build 250,000 homes. If the mayor's plan is saying you need about $600,000, I'm not going to do the math live for everyone, but basically, very little of that 250,000 unit projection that the NDP are promoting to be built. A lot of that is apparently either going to come from the private sector through inclusionary zoning, or it will simply not be built.
When I think a lot of people hear inclusionary zoning and they don't know what it means, and it kind of sounds incredibly boring. But it's actually quite an interesting and controversial subject. Can you explain like I'm 5 years old, how it works?
So there are a lot of different inclusionary zoning models, but the basic premise is for the permission to build market rate housing, the developer either has to provide a certain portion of the units they're building as affordable, or they have to provide cash in lieu. Now, inclusionary zoning programs can come with density bonusing. So let's say your original permissions were to build 20 stories. Now we'll give you an extra 10, and some portion of those 10s you'll provide back to us as affordable. There are other models where it's more voluntary, and there's other models that are less voluntary, and they don't necessarily come with density bonusing. Now, inclusionary zoning is the idea is you can create mixed income buildings versus mixed income communities, because you can have a mixed income community, but there is the wealthy people live in certain buildings, and the moderate income people live in other buildings, and the low income people live in other buildings, but you still have a community that is mixed income. Inclusionary zoning, you can either create mixed income communities, or more typically, it's about focusing on creating mixed income buildings. Now, the idea of inclusionary zoning is it's the opposite of exclusionary zoning. So we're allowing multifamily housing to be built. And to do that, we ask that a certain number of units be provided to a wider range of income individuals. But the problem with that is when you are taking 90% of your growth and you're putting on 10% of the land, there's already a huge competition for land, and there's a lot of expenses, and inclusionary zoning is not paid for by existing residents. It will be paid for by future residents who already are kind of pushed onto very small pieces of land where they have to compete with each other. And so there are a lot of equity issues in terms of who's paying for this stuff. Some of the promoters of inclusionary zoning, they typically don't like to think about, they will tell you developers are paying.
That's
But
what I hear
that's
all
a
the time from politicians. They say it'll
out
generate
of,
profits.
yeah, out of the goodness of their hearts,
So, I mean, it's this kind of sort of like, I don't want to think about what happens over the hill. I just want to look at what happens on the hill. And on that hill, developers pay me, the city. But every dollar a developer takes in, they have to take in from either a renter or a homeowner buying a home. And so, if they can't put the cost onto them, or they can't put the cost onto somebody else, they won't build housing, right? So somebody's got to pay the piper.
And I always hear the density bonus is the key here. I know when Toronto originally passed inclusionary zoning, they didn't have any density bonus, and I just kept hearing from developers that meant they just weren't going to build there. They'll find other places to build.
Yeah, so the city has like a very finicky, funny way so their idea is like, we know 30 or 40 or 50-story towers are going to come onto these lands. We're not going to pre-approve it, but we know when the developer applies for it, they're gonna get all this massive density. The thing is, if from an economist point of view, if I go and I approve 60 stories on a piece of land in the middle of the Canadian Shield, that has no value, right? Because nobody wants to live there. But if I go and I do that in the middle of Toronto, because there's such a demand, unmet demand, that has a lot of value. There's huge returns there. And so the question is, why do we create so much return on these densities, right? If you had already pre-approved a lot of this density, then there wouldn't be that much return. You can kind of think like, okay, if you have 10 lots, there's 10 homes, there's an extra demand for 10 more homes. If you just take one of those homes and you increase the density to 4 units, that person is going to gain a lot. But if you increase the density on all the lots to 4 units, then each lot or landowner is not going to gain that much, right? So it's a way, inclusionary zoning. There was a really unfortunate incident when Toronto was speaking about inclusionary zoning, where a former councillor asked the chief planner, can we use this to block housing? And the chief planner's answer was, that is not our intention. And if you hear that and you parse out exactly what he's not saying no, right? So absolutely, you can use inclusionary zoning to block housing, and we have examples of this. In downtown Vancouver, in their East End, they have an inclusionary zoning policy of 60%. And only one building has been built there since 2014, and it was a social housing kind of building. So, if you're not careful with this, it can really affect your housing supply. And it's a very popular policy among existing homeowners. and it's a very difficult policy to talk about, because if you're against inclusionary zoning, then you must be against people of lower means and who themselves are also struggling. And so, um, it's a tough conversation to have in a straightforward manner.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that, and it's those comments by the city of Charlotte, like it almost reminded me of like a gun manufacturer kind of presenting to Congress and saying, well, no, it's not our intent that our weapons be used for all these things, and of course, that ends up happening because that's the challenge here, that we're basically, that value that Alex spoke about is created through artificial restriction, right? And I start to worry about inclusionary zoning because it gives cities an incentive not to upzone, because then they can keep zoning really tight and then use it as a negotiating chip to get something else. And that ends up being problematic. That ends up being less housing for anyone. So it's one of those things that's like, yeah, okay, this kind of makes sense in theory, but in practice it becomes difficult. And I think a lot of this boils down to this belief that there's somehow a free lunch in housing, right? That we can kind of avoid, expenses and things like that. That we can just foist those off onto something else. But ultimately, you and I and everybody else have to pay for this stuff, right? We either pay through it through taxes or pay through it through higher prices. There's no free lunch here. So I think we need to sort of think through, like, what are the kind of cities that we want to design and how do we get there, rather than coming from a position that we can get all of these great things without paying for it. It's simply not true. We've got to sort of figure out the best way to finance these cities.
Yeah, I mean, so the thing I had take issue with the Ontario NDP plan is they don't state what kind of percentage they're expecting from the private developers. I think they understand that they will get a lot of pushback from the development industry on that, but I also think they would get pushback from both housing advocates and affordable housing advocates. So there's this spectrum of belief some people are like, inclusionary zoning is free affordable housing, and there, if we demand it and we beat a stick in the development industry, we're going to get all this free affordable housing. And I think that is an optimistic view, to say the least. And then you kind of get the spectrum of disbelief, which ranges from, let's say, the market urbanist view, which is, this is a pure tax on housing, you're in a housing crisis, you don't tax the thing that you want, to, if you move to the leftward of the spectrum, so the center left argument would be, this is really regressive because you are charging people who are just making it into the housing market, either on the rental or the ownership side, and you're not charging all the people who already have homes, right? And so there is an equity issue. You are telling people just making it there that you have to pay for the people behind you, but the people who've made it aren't pitching in a single dollar. And so there's that problem. And if you move even farther leftward, there is this critique that the belief in inclusionary zoning is actually just a neoliberal idea. So, this idea that we can farm out a social safety net to the private sector. And so this is neoliberalism with some food coloring of social democracy. And you're not actually getting a real safety net. Developers won't really build it. They'll resist it. And it's just deferring that conversation of how do we actually build a proper housing social safety net and resources correctly.
That's kind of funny because what you're saying is that it sounds like no one likes inclusionary zoning. Who does like it?
So the people who like it are people who are like, we'll never properly resource a social safety net, and so this is the best, worst option we can get. It's the option better than nothing. The problem is, and they also have, I think, some views about its effects on housing. My personal view is I don't think inclusionary zoning optimizes for need. So you're pushing up the price of housing, and so you're actually pushing more people into the wait list of affordable housing. And so, I don't think there's necessarily a net benefit. I really take the view that if you want a social safety net for housing, you have to invest in it, and you can't expect the private market to do it, because the private market, it doesn't provide a social safety net for anything. It doesn't, like, we don't ask car manufacturers, for every 10,000 cars you build, give me a bus, right? Like, And if we did, I think people would be like, well, car manufacturers will leave, or they'll mess about giving you that bus. And you can't depend on the car manufacturers to give you a bus. But what you can do is, you can tax car manufacturers in the same way you tax anybody doing anything, and you take that money and you invest it in the things that you think are important, like a bus.
Do you think we'll start to see the government actually building homes themselves anytime soon?
Um, so the development process is many different steps and stages, right? And so there's everything from going through the regulatory process, going through the financing process, going through the design process, and then going through the construction process itself, and then you hand somebody their keys. Do I see the government becoming covering that entire plethora of actions and stages within the development process? Probably not. I don't think we're going to see them become the Ellis Dawn, where they're going to have construction crews. Maybe they will subcontract out to a general contractor like Ellis Dawn, but I don't see them having like this construction crews that they're going to go build. I do see them becoming a developer in terms of like going through the regulatory process. I do see them becoming a financing arm. They may even become part of that like design process, but I don't see them becoming a general contractor. And with hammers and nails and work crews and all of that. I really just don't see them becoming that sort of a public builder.
I guess like almost what I'm hearing about the kind of social housing plan is that these are essentially the sort of 3P models that progressives usually hate. So, is that a fair characterization here, or is something else getting proposed? What is this essentially going to turn into the Ottawa LRT of housing?
Oh no.
So that's a loaded question. So
Yeah, I put my thumb on the scale a little bit there.
So, first we have to understand like what is the private sector. So a nonprofit that is not owned and operated by the government. So there are nonprofits that are owned and operated by the government. That would be like a hospital. It is owned and operated. But there is a corporation. It has a corporate status, and it is owned and operated by the government. But the private sector has entities. They may be nonprofit entities. They may be, for example, a church group. They're not part of the government, and the government can subcontract, and it does subcontract out to these groups. A lot of transitional housing, for example, a lot of housing providers for that space is done by in almost a 3P model. So a 3P model, I think people have this view of a 3P model that it's the government with some big, massive corporation. But to answer your question directly, yes, it probably will be a 3P model. The government may own and operate some of these buildings in the same model that it does, for example, Toronto Community Housing or York Region Housing. But I think a lot of it will be partnerships with various types of private entities, whether they're on the nonprofit charity side or they are with the for-profit side. And it'll be different. It'll be in different capacities. Either it is to help them build it, help them design it, or help them operate it.
So, what else can the NDP do to make their plan more viable and believable to everyone watching them?
So I think what they need to do is first accept that regardless of whatever dollars they put forward, that they're going to put it through a broken process, and that is our planning regime. And so, coming forward with how are you going to get the zoning done for all of these sites, and really like tackle that problem on a lot of different dimensions. So there's different ideas. There is providing upfront zoning for social housing or nonprofit housing. There's something that in America, what they do is that it's called the builder's remedy, where if municipalities are not zoning quickly enough for affordable housing or for housing in general, then there's this secondary process that affordable housing providers, including potentially the government itself, can go to get their approvals, and you kind of have an alternative approval process. But there needs to be an acknowledgement, I think, at the provincial level that you can't just shove money through it, because you're not going to be spending every dollar to its best possible use. Just to expand on that question just a little bit, there are things that the mayor can do. And the mayor can do is, the problem is traditionally, so Toronto has two entities in this game of when the city itself develops housing. One is Create TO, which is the city's development arm, and the other is city planning, which obviously does all the planning. And to date, what's been the primacy is what city planning wants. And so when CreateTO moves forward on a project, it's about showcasing how do the policies that city planning creates, are they feasible or viable? And frankly, they're often not, and they often lead to a lot of waste. And so, the mayor could go forward and say, look, whatever maximizes affordability and the number of affordable housing, I want that, and I want the development arm of the city to take the lead. And it's not about showcasing whether the city planning's ideas of layer caking buildings or all these weird shaped buildings that they want. It's not about that. It's about affordability and affordable housing. And we've seen problems with when city planning takes primacy. So, I'll just make a quick example, and that is Villers Island. And Villers Island is in the southeast of the city on the lake shore. It's east of the Don Valley Parkway. And it's a piece of land that is being developed because we've done some geotechnical work on the Don Valley River for flood protection. And now that it opened up some land. And, the criticism against city planning is when they did the initial zoning for this land, they zoned it essentially for a European suburb, right? They want it to look like a nice suburb in Copenhagen. But if you look at what the private sector is doing all around this piece of land, is they're designing a downtown because this is close to the downtown. It's going to have an LRT. This is a downtown property, guys. You should be zoning it accordingly to maximize the amount of affordability and affordable housing. Now the city, now that we've kind of pushed the envelope on what is important, they have to go back and they have to rezone all this stuff. And they have, our buildings shape us, we shape buildings. And when you look at a building, if you know what to look for, it can tell you a lot about our values and the values that we are upholding. And it's I think the mayor has to go and she has to make a public message that the values that I want promoted in the work that the city does in its development is affordability and affordable housing, and sure, add some livability, but the livability for people in the buildings. If a shadow hits somebody's home, that's not as important as dealing with our housing crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think having a little bit of shade during a climate crisis might not be the biggest problem that we have. So absolutely, and one of the things I fear about this discussion, particularly with the NDP plan, is we start to mistake objections to the plan with objections to the goal. I think their goal is fantastic. I think they've recognized the extent of the problem. But they need to come up with a realistic, detailed plan with realistic numbers. And I think Alex is absolutely right that this is not just about money. This is not just about forcing more water through a broken pipe. So I think part of what we're going to need to see is the Ontario government, a future Ontario NDP government, get really prescriptive with municipalities to allow far more zoning by right. We're seeing that in other places. Here in Ontario, we're talking a lot about fourplexes as of right. Now in Edmonton, we have sixplexes as of right, and they've really simplified their zoning code. So there's a lot of great things happening. We heard in the United States, there's things happening in Canada as well. But you need to incorporate that as part of a plan. So there's a whole host of regulatory changes coupled with a realistic amount of spending. And you cannot get any kind of home for $60,000. There's no such thing as free land. It needs to be developed, remediated. You need to replace the revenue that land is already generating. So it's just getting some realism in all of this.
Thank you so much for joining us, Alex.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, that was great, Alex, and I would love to thank the audience as well for being here. And if you enjoyed our chat with Alex, please like and subscribe and leave a comment. It would really help us out a lot.
And this episode was produced by Meredith Martin. See you next time.